Still using GNOME? These 5 Linux desktops do it better. If you've ever installed a popular Linux distro for the first time, Ubuntu, Fedora, Pop! OS, there's a good chance you landed on GNOME without even choosing it. It was just there. And for a lot of people, that's fine. GNOME works. But works is not the same as right for you. I've spent years testing every major desktop environment on Linux. And today, I want to show you 5 alternatives that genuinely solve real problems GNOME either ignores or handles poorly. Whether you're on old hardware, coming from Windows or Mac OS, or just want more control over your workspace, one of these is going to click for you. Let's get into it.
Number 1. Cinnamon. The one for Windows users who feel lost on GNOME. Let's start with Cinnamon. When you first boot into GNOME, there's no taskbar. There's no traditional start menu. You press a key, get an overview, and go from there. For people coming from years of Windows use, that workflow feels completely upside down. Cinnamon fixes this immediately. You get a panel at the bottom of the screen, a start menu in the corner, and a desktop where you can actually put files and shortcuts. It's the muscle memory you've already built. It just works the way you already expect a computer to work. But here's what I want to be clear about. Cinnamon is not a beginner-only desktop. Underneath that familiar surface, there's a serious system. Multiple panel support, desklets, hot corners, workspace switcher, fine-grained window management. The more you explore, the more you find. It's best experienced on Linux Mint, which was built around Cinnamon and remains its flagship home.
You can also find it on Ubuntu Cinnamon and Fedora's Cinnamon Spin, if you want to try it without fully committing.
Number 2, Pantheon. The one for people who actually want macOS minimalism. Now, GNOME has always had a macOS-inspired aesthetic. Clean lines, no clutter, a top bar, but it's always felt like a casual flirtation with that idea rather than a real commitment to it. Pantheon commits. Developed by the Elementary OS team, Pantheon gives you a clean top panel, a polished bottom dock, and a design language built entirely around getting out of your way. Everything is intentional. Every element has a purpose. Virtual desktops exist, but they're not the centerpiece of your experience the way they are in GNOME. What's interesting about Pantheon is that it deliberately limits how much you can customize it. And that's actually a feature, not a flaw. If you've ever spent 2 hours tweaking your desktop instead of actually using your computer, Pantheon solves that problem by deciding a lot of things for you and deciding them well. It's also surprisingly suitable for shared computers or younger users, because the experience stays clean and consistent no matter what. Pantheon lives primarily on Elementary OS, which is worth installing just to see what a thoughtfully designed Linux desktop looks like. It's also available on OpenSUSE if you want it alongside a different base system.
Number 3, XFCE. The one for older hardware, or anyone who hates wasting resources. Linux has a well-earned reputation for breathing life into old machines. The problem is, if you install a GNOME-based distro on that old laptop, you might actually make things worse. GNOME is one of the heaviest desktop environments in the Linux ecosystem. At idle, it regularly consumes well above 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. On modern hardware with 16 or 32 gigs of memory, that's manageable. On a machine with 4 or 6 gigs, especially one you're trying to revive, that's a real problem. XFCE is the answer. It idles at around 500 megabytes of RAM, which is roughly a third of what GNOME uses, while still giving you everything you'd expect from a complete desktop environment. Panels, workspaces, a capable file manager called Thunar, solid theming support, and a settings system that doesn't require extensions to do basic things. It doesn't look as polished as KDE or GNOME out of the box.
But with a bit of theming effort, XFCE can look genuinely great. And it'll do it without dragging your system down. Best options here are Ubuntu, Linux Mint XFCE Edition, and Manjaro XFCE, all of which are well-configured starting points.
Number 4, Mate Desktop. The one built on a desktop that a generation of Linux users loved. For anyone who used Linux in the early to mid-2000s, GNOME 2 was the desktop. It ran for nearly a decade. It was stable, familiar, and just made sense. Then GNOME 3 arrived, threw most of that away, and divided the community almost overnight. Mate exists because a group of developers refused to let GNOME 2 simply disappear. They forked the original codebase and have been maintaining it ever since, adding modern security patches, high DPI display support, and continued development to keep it current without abandoning what made it great. What you get is a desktop that feels like a well-worn tool. 2 panels by default, a classic application menu, sensible window management, and a layout that never fights you. It's predictable in the best possible way. Some people write Mate off as retro or nostalgic. I push back on that. It's a fully modern, actively maintained desktop environment that happens to not chase trends. That makes it rock solid as a daily driver, especially on machines where reliability matters more than visual flair. Try it on Ubuntu Mate, Linux Mint Mate Edition, or the Fedora Mate Compiz Spin. Number 5, KDE. The one that makes GNOME's customization model look like a toy. And then there's KDE Plasma, and this one deserves some real attention. Here's the thing about GNOME. Out of the box, it's minimal to a fault. If you want to add features, change the way the panel works, adjust window behavior, or do basically anything beyond changing your wallpaper, you need extensions. And those extensions have a habit of breaking after major GNOME updates. It's a real limitation that experienced users hit over and over. KDE Plasma doesn't have that problem. Everything, and I mean everything, is already built in. Window tiling, desktop widgets, per-window rules, animated effects, deep keyboard shortcut customization, multiple panel configurations, activities that function like virtual desktops on steroids. None of that requires installing anything extra. It's all there, stable across versions, and it works. What surprises a lot of people is that KDE Plasma actually runs lighter than GNOME in 2025. Recent versions of KDE Plasma 6 idle at well under 800 megabytes of RAM, which is remarkable given how much more it ships with compared to GNOME. The comparison isn't even close when you lay it out side by side. GNOME gives you a clean foundation and makes you build on top of it with external tools that may or may not break. KDE gives you a complete, coherent system that was designed to work together from day one. Best distributions to experience this on: Ubuntu, the Fedora KDE Spin, and Garuda Linux for those who want something more visually dialed in. So there you have it. 5 desktop environments that each solve something GNOME doesn't. Cinnamon for the Windows crowd, Pantheon for the minimalists, XFCE for the hardware conscious, Mate for those who want reliability without compromise, and KDE Plasma for anyone who wants total control of their workspace without duct taping it together with extensions. GNOME isn't bad, but popular doesn't mean best, and none of these desktops exist by accident. They each exist because GNOME left a real gap, and each one fills it convincingly. If you've been quietly frustrated with something about your current Linux setup, there's a good chance one of these is the answer. Drop a comment letting me know which desktop environment you're running, and if you've ever switched away from GNOME, what made you do it? I'd love to know. If this was helpful, subscribe for more Linux content, and I'll see you in the next one.